Hello there. You are tuning in to KPCA LP Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. Gotta work my radio voice on that one. I want to make it exciting. So you are here with DG the 30-something for State of the Union. My show tonight is on bullying at all levels of where bullying can occur, so not just with children. And I do want to start by saying, before I start my topic, I want to talk a little bit about PCA and the KPCA project of Petaluma Community Access. So if you don't know, PCA is Petaluma Community Access. People worked for many, many years to get the radio project started, which we now know as KPCA, or you can stream on kpca.fm to see any of our programming. But the cool thing about community-based radio is that it gives any community member an opportunity to express their opinions or their feelings, whether it's through talk or music, or, whatever makes them tick. So it's a really unique opportunity. It's not, you're not hired by a commercial radio station to represent one voice or the other. You get to represent your own. And the reason I bring that up is because it is very important to the organization that we have people who are willing to support it in the community. So Petaluma has a really unique service. There's a really unique service to Petaluma. Most other cities do not have this community radio, community TV opportunity where members can share their media, their expression, whether it's through video, TV, or whether it is through radio. So I really want to emphasize two things. So if you can donate or sponsor, or you're interested in underwriting an individual show, please contact us. And you can contact me. It looks like the email we have here is kpca@pca.tv. So that's kind of a generic one, but you can also reach me directly if you'd like to chat more about your donation options at domayne@maberme.com. Also, if you have any questions about my show or for me or anything like that, I know that I'm getting a different viewership as time goes on, or more viewership, so I want to make sure that I'm accessible to people. So if you're watching on Facebook, of course you can reach out to me there. If you're listening in, you can reach out to me via email. If you're driving or don't have a pen in your hand and listening, you can contact Petaluma Community Access and they will direct you my way. So, please, if you can contribute, everything matters, and you can cruise to our website, Paletta. I can't talk today. It's been such a long day. It's only Tuesday. You can go to petalumacommunityaccess.org, and you can see how to get involved in a lot of ways. So, and we have a fancy new website, so please check that out. And again, we had a great event at Lagunitas, so thank you on May 20th. So thank you for everyone who came to that, and keep your eye out for new opportunities to get involved. You can also become a member if you're interested in video or radio. We have a lot of resources that are offered with your membership within the facility. So if you don't have access to, the video graphic programming you're looking for, most likely we have can give access to it here. So that is my spiel about that. But so let's get to the subject of my show. So today I am doing a show on bullying. And this is a really kind of complex issue for me because we very often talk about bullying when it comes to youth. And, you know, we kind of, in our minds, I'm generalizing, but of course. But I would say culturally, we lean toward bullying be something that youth do, something that teenagers do, when in actuality, for many of us, it is something that occurs throughout our lives for a bunch of different reasons. And then we also have seen it in the political context over the last couple elections, not just the last federal election, or local election. But I'll get into all of that later. But that's kind of an overview of where the show is going to go. So I am going to start with bullying among children, and I'm going to do so because there is a significantly larger investment, in my opinion, in actual policy development in order to potentially protect children from bullying. And I use the word potentially protect them in an intentional way. So bullying is on the rise. I think that that's something, or, you know, it's an interesting thing. And I look for statistics on that, and I will provide other statistics throughout the show that could be indications that bullying is on the rise. But the interesting thing about that is that the perception of bullying has changed over time pretty significantly. So I wanted to start with my story because I think it shows how bullying and the perception of bullying has changed over time. So when I was in high school, I was heavily bullied. And again, I'll refer back to this throughout the show because I think it's really important when you talk about the legislation and the target populations of what is the definition of bullying. But for me, it was debilitating. So it actually made it so I did not want to go to school anymore. And there was a few things that kept me in high school. One of which was that I loved school. I was a highly academic student. And then I was also on the varsity golf team. So that is something that actually kept me in school because I knew that if I went to the JC and finished my coursework and took the GED, that I would no longer be eligible to play golf. So it kind of shows how athletics can also help high school students through adversity, which, again, I don't think golf is generally talked about as one of those sports, but it is. And again, I'll touch on this throughout the show because it's going to have context throughout the show. But I start with that because the major reason is I was heavily bullied. My car was vandalized several times when I was in high school, and the car was actually owned by my parents, which I'll get to in a second. And I was really tormented. I had someone spit on me when I was walking by, and, you know, nasty words kind of came with it. I had rumors started about who I was sleeping with and really everything you could imagine about how I took care of my body or different things like that. And there was several elements that I felt like was a contributor to that. So one of the ones that we don't really think about is that, so I was a very small girl when I was in high school. I was a very small build. I was very thin. And I remember going to the pediatrician, and it was, I can't remember, I don't think it was the OBGYN, but I think I went to a pediatrician, and I remember them looking at me and saying, well, do you eat? And that was their explanation for the fact that I was having anxiety issues, which actually weren't identified for until I was well into my adulthood. But I had stomach issues, and so their major assumption was that I was anorexic or bulimic. because I was such a small build. So that didn't help because a lot of assumptions, and I'm not taking away from women and girls that do experience that, and that's kind of the problem when I was going up with identifying those kind of illnesses, is that there was just assumptions made, like, oh, you have one body type, so then you have body image issues, which is, or eating issues, or, you know, however you want to look at that. So that was part of the issue, and I know I'm not the only girl that experienced that, and which was not the case. I did have a lot of body image issues, but I was not going to that point. That wasn't where my methodology was in dealing with my body image issues. I really just didn't want to go to school anymore. So the other part of it is that my family was really my major saving grace, because they were super supportive, and I was able to go home to a secure home where I was encouraged to continue my life even though I was bullied. And it was this kind of whole attitude that I really was able to embrace, that if I stopped going to school, that they won. And I'm not saying that always it works for everyone, but it really worked for me, because, you know, it's like I'd have to give up golfing. I'd have to give up taking these classes with really smart people that I really enjoy. I'd have to give up taking these AP classes and working with these teachers I really like. And so that was a big part of it. But my mom went to the school counselor, called several times because I was having a really hard time. It started when I was about 15. And she went to the counselors, or, you know, some sort of leadership there, and they basically told her that that's how teenagers act. And so at that time, it was just accepted that teenagers are just bullies. That's just how they act, which is ridiculous. But that just goes to show, I graduated high school, God, can I do the math right now? Like 15 years ago. So I'm about to show how things have changed so much over time. So, you know, those were kind of the two elements. Now I can't remember what the third element was, but I know what it was. So boys. I'll call them boys. I also got a lot of sexist comments, especially because I was a female golfer. We were actually even bullied by the male golf team, basically being told that women can't golf, and we can't do this, and we can't do that. And so I think in that context, it was kind of a driver to be like, well, I'll show you. But I think in a lot of other contexts, when you have someone taking the dominant stance, white men, we know that they have the most prominent dominant stance in this country, and that is not a biased statement. That is actually the truth. So if you have an issue with me saying that, then go do some research. But that was a major part of the issue, is that there was this huge kind of, well, you're never going to be as good as, you can never try as hard, you're never going to be as smart. And so that was something that was really prevalent still when I was in high school. And again, at that time, it was just accepted as, well, this is just how teenagers are. This is just how high school is. This is just the process you have to go through. And also, and I've shared this before on my radio show, is that I was sexually assaulted when I was 15. And so that did lead to a certain story got out, which was not the true story. And because of that, that was actually a big precursor to a lot of my bullying. And it just goes to show how those types of issues are potentially dealt with. So, and I should take a point to say that some of my topics on my show are sensitive. I will get into domestic violence and other sorts of abuse. So just as a starting point, and I was supposed to say at the beginning of the show that my opinions do not reflect the opinions of PCA/KPCA, its board, its members, its staff, or any of its affiliates. So I'm not saying that to not be serious, but it is serious. So this is about me. My show is a editorial at the end of the day. So I wanted to start with the general definition of bullying. So it's very simple in the dictionary, and it says that bullying, or a bully, is one who seeks harm to intimidate or coerce someone who is perceived as vulnerable. And so it's a very broad definition, which I think is probably better than where the California state law that indicates how schools behave law is, or legislation is. So let me get into some of that. So all of the states have adopted some sort of bullying laws. They do vary for obvious reasons among the states, but some commonalities that were, and so this is from stopbullying.gov. I always like to state my sources, but some of the commonalities that have been recognized and stated are that the legislation defined bullying. It defined the characteristics of bullying, the commonly targeted groups for bullying, which I'll get to. And then it also detailed requirements for school policy. Now, people that watch my show know that I love reading through code, but I looked up these codes and it is a lot. It is so much. So if you want to read the California code, luckily each link isn't a ton of information. I would have preferred to be able to see the whole code in one document, which I'm sure I can, but they do have every state's code at stopbullying.gov. So you can, if you're interested in how the states differ and want to spend a good night, it'll probably put you to sleep, but you can read the code. And to be fair, this one actually I felt was a little bit easier to digest than a lot of other code I read. So you can look into that. And so a lot of the codes also include sexual harassment into their bullying code. And I think sexual harassment has had a definition for quite some time, but I do think that it has evolved based on how the time has evolved. So this is kind of where things get interesting for me. So the California legislation has identified those who are targeted. I don't even know how to put this, and I don't feel like they put it in a proper way, but these are, going back to the original definition, these are who I would the state of California considers to be perceived as vulnerable. I've been this way all day, just trying to talk, can't talk. So the characteristic of those who are perceived to be vulnerable by the state of California are those with a disability, or there is bullying based on gender identity, gender expression, nationality, race or ethnicity, or any characteristic that is contained in the definition of hate crimes, or those who are associated by any of those definitions that are in hate crimes. And my question is if this is really substantial. So I don't think that this necessarily encompasses all those who are vulnerable, especially in my situation. I wasn't targeted for any of these reasons outside of being bullied based on gender, as I mentioned, because of my athletic affiliation. The other aspects, I didn't fall into any of these categories. And so I think that, and it wasn't also by association. I wasn't bullied based on association with people in these categories. And I'm not saying that these categories of the perceived vulnerable aren't important to point out, but my point in my analysis is that I don't think that this is a substantial definition of the vulnerable populations that can be bullied. Again, I don't think that you have to fall into one of these categories to be bullied. I was bullied for, kind of in hindsight, as I understand it, high school is very cliquey, as I saw, and I felt that I was bullied because I never fell into one of these groups, and so I wasn't easily identifiable. So it was actually the opposite. I couldn't be identified as being one thing or the other, and therefore I was bullied for not falling into a silo. And then I was charged with planning my 10-year reunion because I knew everyone, because I didn't only associate with one group or the other. So I don't feel that this is a all-inclusive definition of the vulnerable populations. And I do think that, while I know not everyone's sitting around reading California code, this is an indication of how policies are developed by schools and at the local level. And so I do think that it needs to be reconsidered. And I hope that schools take a broader approach, and really no one should be bullied. It doesn't matter what association you have, or what vulnerable population you belong to, no one should be bullied. So let's talk about, this is one of the sensitive topics, and it's Anthony Bourdain's birthday, which many of us know committed suicide. Was it last year? I think it was just last year. And if you don't know who Anthony Bourdain is, he was kind of this world traveler and a very humble dude. It was really cool what he did. And I always do consider that he made travel more accessible to an entire generation, perceived as accessible, because he went all over the world. I think he was a famous chef to begin with. I believe his first show that really took off was No Reservations, where he went around the world and went to different areas and restaurants that were lesser known to experience the culture. And I think that really exposed probably my generation, perhaps a generation before, to what it can look like to travel and really decrease that fear. So I just got to give a shout out to Anthony Bourdain today, since it's his birthday and it's Bourdain Day. So the suicide rate has gone up. So compared to 1981, the suicide rate in 2016 was almost double. And I'll just leave that there. I don't think it needs a whole lot of explanation. And we've also seen, I couldn't find specific statistics about children, but the interesting thing about a lot of children's statistics is that the government doesn't really allow them to be compiled. So my background's in public health, and we talk about children's obesity, but there's actually rules against saying that children are obese. So there's a lot of weird kind of things, and that also goes with domestic violence and suicide. Those numbers are very hard to actually compile. I've talked about this in my gun violence shows and my mass shooting shows, because there's kind of this avoidance from, in my opinion, from actually reporting the information accurately. So the government has definitely played a part in this, and so that's why I think a lot of independent sources have gotten involved in order to make sure that the data is consistent. So I'm kind of just leaving that statistic there. I didn't want to get too in-depth to any one thing or the other. I will get a little bit more in-depth to domestic abuse, as I think that it is a major indication of how bullying can go through adulthood. But my main comment with adult bullying is that it doesn't stop. And I have spoken in high school classrooms, and I am a pretty raw, honest person, if you don't know me. And I always, in some versions, say, I wish I could tell you that bullying stopped when you left school, but it just doesn't. And that's kind of where this transition into adult bullying in my show is going, because unfortunately bullying does not stop when you're an adult, and you can learn to become more resilient and control your reactions, and those are kind of the things I've learned over my lifetime. But it's not easy, it's not just automatic, like, oh, I'm just gonna learn how to deal with bullying now. I've dealt with it my entire life. And don't get me wrong, not everyone deals with bullying. There are bullies, and there's a lot of reasons for why people bully others. And I don't want to get into, if you're interested in a really great read about different psychological conditions, and it's a very easy read relatively. It's not a heavily scientific book. However, they integrate scientific research, and it is written by, I believe, a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And the psychologist is a forensic psychologist, which specializes in forensic psychology, which forensic psychology are psychologists that work with those who are entering the criminal justice system, are going to enter the criminal justice system. And a lot of what they do is kind of assess where that person is at before a verdict is come to in court. So it's easy to say that in some states, forensic psychology is a little stronger than others, as we know. But it's a really interesting book. It's called Born for Love. I think it's, the subtitle is Why Empathy is Dying But Needed, something along those lines. But it's a great book because it goes into a lot of bullying, oppression situations from the bully's perspective and the bullied perspective. And so the main story that comes to mind, I don't want to share because it's a little graphic and sensitive. So, but I highly, highly recommend that book. Like I said, it's a super easy read for a psychology-based book. So I recommend that. But, so again, it doesn't stop. Let me get back to sexual harassment. So, many of us have experienced bullying, unless you are the bully, although many bullies also experience bullying. And bullying takes place in the workplace. So, there is a slew of statistics that I've provided in other shows about how different bullying occurs in the workplace, and it has a lot to do with discrimination. So I can't go through the whole slew of how discrimination is defined because I don't know it off the top of my head, but there is a lot of discrimination in the workplace. And so that is something that's really important. On a personal level, I have experienced the most discrimination because I'm a woman or based on age. And these are blatant things that are happening. This isn't, because, there's always that thought process where it's just, oh, it's in your head, you're being defensive, or one thing or the other. But these are blatant attacks at my age or my gender, and people have said things really directly about my age or my gender and my inability to do my job because of those two things. And so that's a form of bullying, because you are trying to make someone feel less than because of the situation I was born in. I can't control my age. I can't control my gender. And then statistics do show that, of course, things get worse if you are a woman of color, especially, but if you are a man of color as well. You get into the pay gaps, the what am I trying to say? The disciplinary action gaps again, we can talk about incarceration rates and how that's bullying, where we're keeping Black men primarily in jail and prison, well above the rates of any other population in the United States. And that also just includes actual sentencing. So it's not just, well, I mean, I guess they're correlated. Those who are in jail and prison were sentenced to jail and prison, but what pretty much all the research shows that is from scientific sources is that if you are a man of color, you are getting a harder sentence than a white man. And so you are way more likely to be sentenced to jail or prison and are way more likely to have a harder sentence than if you were a white man. So those statistics are very significant. And again, for me, the biggest thing about bullying, which I should have brought up at the beginning, is it's about subordination and control. And so I think that while bullying is defined in a very broad way as how you are attacking the vulnerable, I think that the end game is about power and taking control over someone. And that comes in all different levels, but I have never experienced or heard someone's experience about bullying where that wasn't the core issue. It is about power. It is about control. And, that's one of my things on here is that it's about power. And so we've seen in elections for a long time, but I think it's really, really become prominent in the last, how many years has it been? 12 years. The last 12 years in elections, really. And again, I could have a bias because that's kind of within my age range of where I was really following things, but I did follow things well before that, so I do think that I have somewhat of a perspective that I think people will agree with. But anyway, it's my perspective, is that in politics, the last 12 years have introduced a different level of bullying in a powerful, dominant adult environment. So we have seen the debate die. Actually, I always say that every high school student should be required to take a debate class, or at least you can't come out of college. I mean, really, it'd be best to teach elementary school students debate, because people watch presidential debates and then they assume that's what a debate is, but it's actually not at all. It's really just an argument, and it's really just, there's no argument sent and a rebuttal and a response. It's all just, I'm going to say petty things to attack your character or your perceived character to the masses that follow me, instead of actually having a productive debate or conversation around the issues to show where your standing is and why your standing is better. And so when you take a debate class, you're never graded on if your position is right, because that would be against debating. Your grade is based on how well you responded and explained to the viewer that your position was correct. And so it's really about who is the most thought out. And I don't want to call it convincing, because again, that sounds manipulative, but it's really about showing why your perspective is the accurate perspective. And it's really just about being more accurate and presenting it better than the person that you were debating with, which is a complete lost art. Our presidential candidates at all levels, we, even at the local level, I have never seen an actual debate happen. It's all just about yammering about where you stand about things and why the other person's wrong because they don't agree. So, and I don't think I really need to get into this in depth, because I think people have seen where people have been targeted based on gender, race, ethnicity, standpoint, sexual orientation in the last 12 years. I think that's really obvious. People have been attacked for a myriad of reasons. And we've seen in the Trump administration, we have seen a blatant display of bullying for a lot of different groups of people. And I think what it comes down to, again, for me, is that it is taking control and power. And I always say that populations are separated, are easily controlled. And so and my last show is on polarization in politics. So if you missed that, check that out. But it does cause this polarization of people where it's basically saying, I am bullying this other person because they're not like me and therefore they're wrong. Not saying, well, they have an alternative perspective and I don't agree with it and this is why. And so that's really the difference between just being a blatant bully and being able to have a productive conversation. And again, this comes all the way down to the local level. I was not even running for office in the last local election, but I was pretty blatantly bullied prior, where I felt that my character was being threatened, or defamation of my character was being threatened, because that person's perception of where I stood was, one, not in agreement with them, which is fine. You can have a conversation with someone. But because I didn't agree with them, then they tried to bully me into making different decisions and therefore taking a different standpoint on how I was handling certain situations. And so this isn't a federal level issue. This goes all the way down to the city of Petaluma local arena, which is, frankly, for me, it's embarrassing. You know, we act like California is so progressive, but in so many ways, I don't actually think we are that different. I think that we live in a bubble where and a lot of Californians think that we actually are better than other areas, but in reality, we do fall victim to a lot of the same circumstances, perhaps on the more liberal pole than the conservative pole of a lot of areas. And we still experience the same income gaps. We still experience vast amounts of poverty. And so, again, I think that the point is that without being able to look outside your bubble and actually listen to people, and then to just say to them, well, you're wrong, and so you need to change your opinion, and you cannot express otherwise, that is bullying. And again, targeting people because of age. I think that I was targeted because of age and by affiliation. So back into the original definition of bullying. And I think that this person, because they were much older than me, I think double my age, not that anyone's counting, they probably felt, and I'm making an assumption, but I felt that they could force me to change my mind because they somehow had more experience and a better perspective than I did. Which is, luckily, I was bullied a lot before, and I will not be bullied now in any context. So the news media kind of goes along with politics. So we have seen a lot of bullying in the news media. I do think that it is more subtle, and I think that's intentional because it is more manipulative. The media is more manipulative than the blatant political bullying that we've seen. And again, I think that's strategic because when you manipulate people, you actually have a better chance of changing their minds, not in a fully, I don't know, how do I describe it? People can be very vulnerable. And when they are manipulated, they will actually change their mind to align with that. And so I think that's where media falls. I think that they are very subtle about how they bully. I think that it's in a very manipulative manner. I think that, what is it, Bill O'Reilly that's in the movie Outfox? I mean, he's blatantly is just bullying people, but I think that was many years ago that was highlighted. And I think that it's become a little bit more subtle, but what we see with the news media is that it is very biased. So I talked a lot about this in my last show when I talked about political polarization. So I think that, again, I think it's more subtle. I think that the media is trying to kind of come under the radar and say, well, I'm taking power over this position or this group of people, and therefore you should follow me because they are inferior to you. And that's where the media and totalitarianism is very strong and very smart at being able to manipulate people's feelings by making them feel, well, this person is not you, and therefore they're inferior, regardless of who they are, who you are, where you stand, where they stand. It's basically telling you that this group, this idea, this identity is inferior because it's different than yours, and therefore you should hate it. You should vote against it. You should work against it. You should do everything you can to suppress this identity. And, we've seen it with women's rights all over the country now, all over the South. And I think it's this whole arsenal, again, of saying, well, these people aren't like you. But then, and there's a lot of lies that go with bullying. There's a lot of, like I said, when I was in high school, it was a bunch of lies that was contributed to my bullying. There's a lot of lies and manipulation that go with that to convince people that they need to not be a part of this group. And again, the polarization of government, the manipulation of political officials to get voted into office to then control and not represent their jurisdictions is a big part of it. So those are all things to consider. So domestic abuse, I'm definitely not going to be able to get into all of this because I only have 15 minutes left, but I did want to talk about domestic violence because it is a very tangible part of bullying that I think a lot of people can understand. Not saying that people can't understand other types of bullying, but I think this is a very tangible thing. So let me start with sexual harassment. So between 2017 and 2018, sexual harassment cases that were reported went up 13.6%. And that is to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who tracks those things and receives those complaints. So that has been up, and that is for both genders. That was not isolated to one gender or the other. So let me get into some statistics. So domestic violence, including sexual assaults, in 2018, this is from Social Solutions, is the source, is that 1 in 3 women were assaulted and 1 in 9 men were assaulted. 20 women per minute are domestically assaulted in this in this country. Domestic violence is 15% of all violent crimes in the United States. Let's see. So, domestic violence is experienced 85% women and 15% men. The last known data at this point was 2010. I think that was from the CDC. Oh no, the Center for American Progress. And again, the government is very protective and limited release about this kind of information, which could be a whole show on its own about censorship and government transparency. And so 1/3 of all female homicides victims are the result of domestic violence. Also from the Center for American Progress. 5 million children a year are exposed to domestic violence, and that is from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And as I did mention before, because government statistics are so kind of wishy-washy about the issue, you see that a lot of independent organizations have taken on the task. And, you know, you always have to have some level of scrutiny, but you can also see kind of the spread and the impact of the organization and do a deduction. And a lot of these organizations actually do pull from CDC and FBI information. So, again, it's about checking your sources. I went through a lot of different data and a lot of this aligned. So, you know, I was getting these debates with people where they just say, well, show me the data. I was like, I can show you like 15. I got in a debate about vaccinations the other day, and, you know, I was like, I can show you 15 studies that show what I'm saying. We don't prove things in science. We show correlation, but I can show you all these things that show it. So anyway, when you're going to look at me and tell me I'm a liar, I'm not making it up. So, of course, men report less. And I should say, of course, all reports are lower than what's actually happening. But the men reporting less could, of course, contribute to the gap in occurrency. But again, women aren't reporting. Not all women are reporting either. So I gotta get to this. So I do want to say these two. So killings as related to domestic violence are up 11% since 2014. And this number was falling for many years. And that is FBI data. And the cost of domestic violence annually is about $8.3 billion, and that's like social services, medical services, all that stuff, as reported by the CDC. So let's jump to, because I have less than 10 minutes. So the effects of bullying. So I think it was a majority, there was a data set, but I think a majority of people report that there are long-term effects of bullying at all aspects. And I know that as a child, even though I was in high school, as a child being bullied, that did really follow me. I mean, it does follow me to this day, but I was able to overcome it in my lifetime, which is an amazing thing that I was able to overcome that, because not everyone's going to overcome the trauma of being bullied. And to the extent I was bullied and the impact it had on my life, and so kind of that trauma and the different levels of bullying at all levels of education and life really does have a long-term impact on people and their mental health, because it does start to get to you, for lack of a better term, is that it really does start to affect your day-to-day life and how you feel about yourself and how you look at yourself, and you start believing, I mean, especially as a child and a teenager, it's so hard when you're going through these major transitionary periods, especially as a teenager, you know, you're going through all these hormonal changes and these physical changes, and you're also being bullied at the same time for one reason or the other, and then you start believing it, like, well, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. I don't fit in. I'm not the way I don't look the way I'm supposed to. I'm not acting the way I'm supposed to. And so it actually can very significantly affect the social relationships of someone for a very long time. And it did. I mean, it took me until after after college before I could really identify that bullying that occurred at all different levels when I was in high school actually affected my entire life and how I behaved towards people, and my lack of trust, and how I socialized and who I socialized with. And so these are very significant things. This is not just how teenagers act. This is not just how the workplace is. This is not just how politics is. These things really, really hurt people for a very long time. And, you know, in hindsight, it's like, yeah, a lot of it was lies, but you don't know that when you're going through it. You just feel this pressure of people basically out there talking smack about you, and then they are able to convince the masses, and then all of a sudden it's not just this individual, it's this group of individuals who have this groupthink or gang mentality, which is another common way that groupthink is known as, where now they're a part of this group and you're outcasted. And I think that that's something that I think it starts happening a lot younger. But I do think that this idea of groupthink or gang mentality really comes into play in high school, where you really are forced to be a part of a group. And if you are not a part of that group, therefore you are, I don't want to call it a threat, because at the time it's not seen as a threat. I mean, in hindsight, I think it's a threat to that groupthink identity. But at the time, you're basically the outcast, and so you're an easy target of that group for one reason or the other. So I think, I hope in this day and age, after we've seen the progression of bullying and how it's controlled now, or how it's tried to be controlled now, I don't think we're addressing a lot of the core mental illness issues and upbringing of both the bully and the bullied, because to some extent the bully, let's give the child who's a bully the benefit of the doubt for a second. They are a product of both their genetics and their upbringing. And so without addressing the source of the bullying, which might be their parents might be bullies. Maybe they were bullies their whole life. Maybe they're complete jerks to people in their adult life. And so I don't necessarily think that the bullies, it should be entirely punitive. I think that when it does get physical, we do need to consider options. But I also think you need to look at the bully and say, what conditions have you been raised in, or what conditions do you have to go home to that are contributing to this behavior? And while I think it's the parents' responsibility, of course, to raise their kids in a empathetic manner, I also realize that in order to actually stop these issues, that those children need some mentors that are going to break that cycle. You likely can't change the parents, but you can have an impact on the kids. And there's examples of that all the time. And that kind of comes to the main solution. I mean, there's a whole long list on these websites of solutions to bullying, but I really think it comes down to early identification of both the bully and the bullied. And it's not easy. And again, you can Google what are the warning signs of a bully, or my kid's being bullied, or is the bully. And really, if you're a parent, I'm not a parent, so I know I always fall under scrutiny, but I like to say, if you are the parent, please be observant and pay attention to the psychological and behavioral state of your child. A lot of bullies are bullies from the time they are very young, and I think it's actually harder to identify the bullied than the bully. When I was in high school, I really never would admit that I was being bullied. It took me a very long time after that. My parents did recognize that I was being heavily bullied, because my car got vandalized and a police officer came to my house because it was my parents' car and said, well, what did she do to other people? Again, that was their explanation at the time. But I think it's harder to identify the bullied over the bully, especially when there's not physical altercations involved. Girls are known for a lot of psychological warfare versus physical warfare. And that psychological warfare, in many ways, is very debilitating, because, again, it's highly manipulative, it's under the radar, it's hard for school administrators and teachers to identify, because, it's out on the playground where you're being spit on like I was, or you're being told that you're sleeping around with all these people. I don't know how else to put it. It's the only way to put it. When it's not true. And so it's that manipulation, and then you start to doubt how you're living, even though it's not true, but you just don't know how to mitigate the issue. And so, but I think the roots, and I was just having this conversation, there is a big difference between sympathy and empathy. And I think that empathy, to some extent, is innate. I think that there are children who are born empathetic. But I also think that it's possible to teach empathy, especially when it starts at a very young level. And it might be a different form of empathy than the innate version of empathy, but at the very least, you can really teach your children how to see a life in someone else's shoes. And I think the value of that is really how we raise children and affect families in a positive manner to say, hey, this person is going through this and that, and you just need to be able to understand that it may not be what you're going through, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. And just, it's what we say all the time, like, just imagine you're placed in their shoes, but it goes beyond just saying that. It's about teaching that to children, and I think it's much harder with adults. I think that it's much easier. I think that something really catastrophic in an adult's life that kind of has to strip down who they are at that point in order to become more of an empathetic person is possible. People can argue me on that, but there's a lot of psychological research that would indicate that. So I am totally out of time. I totally ran out of time. So again, I know that people are really interested in this topic, and I am very happy to continue the conversation. Especially, I tend to like to get a little bit more into my analysis, which I wasn't able to, but I really think I wanted to end with the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is saying, you're going through a hard time, I feel bad. Empathy is, I can feel what you're going through. And so those are two very different experiences. So thank you so much for joining me. Again, you are listening to KPCALP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. You can join me not next Tuesday, but the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. Hope to see ya.